Totemist. Gwynevere's Oak. Looking back on my childhood in rural Ireland, I'm struck by how memories take on different shapes when viewed through adult eyes. The forest behind our house, which once seemed endless and mysterious, now appears modest on Google Maps. Just a few acres of mixed woodland pressing against the boundaries of modern development. But in the early 2000s, to a lonely 8-year-old girl, those trees held infinite possibilities and ultimately salvation. Our house sat at the edge of the village, a weathered stone structure that had seen better days. The wallpaper in my room was peeling, and the floorboards creaked ominously at night. But these weren't the things that made our home unwelcoming. The atmosphere inside carried a weight that had nothing to do with physical deterioration. My father worked at the local pub, though worked might be too generous a term. He spent more time on the customer's side of the bar than behind it, coming home late with unsteady steps and a temper that seemed to worsen with each passing year. The smell of whiskey preceded him and his belt like a warning system, giving me time to retreat to my room. Or, if things seemed particularly volatile, to slip out the back door into the welcoming embrace of the forest. My mother was a different kind of storm. Where my father's rage was loud and obvious, hers was quiet and precise. She had a talent for finding weaknesses, for delivering words that cut deeper than any physical blow. "Useless girl," she would say, her voice carrying a disappointment that seemed to date back to my birth. "Can't do anything right, just like your father." I learned early on to make myself scarce, to become as invisible as possible within our small house. I developed a sixth sense for approaching footsteps, for the subtle changes in atmosphere that preceded conflict. The forest became my sanctuary, my escape route, my true home. It was during one of these forest retreats that I first met Gwynevere. I was hiding behind a fallen log, nursing a bruised arm and trying to steady my breathing when she appeared. At first, I thought she was a reflection of sunlight through leaves. But then the light took shape, forming into someone extraordinary. She was small, no taller than palm, with wings that shimmered like soap bubbles in sunlight. Her dress seemed to be made from cobwebs and morning dew, and her hair moved in ways that didn't match the forest's breeze. But it was her eyes that captured me. They held wisdom and kindness in equal measure, along with something else I couldn't quite name. "Hello, little one," she said, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "I've been watching you for some time now." I wasn't surprised by her appearance. Somehow, it seemed perfectly natural that a fairy would exist in my forest. "Are you going to grant me wishes?" I asked, thinking of fairy tales I'd read in the school library. Gwynevere smiled, but there was sadness in it. "I'm not that kind of fairy, dear heart, but I can be your friend, if you'd like." And so began a friendship that would reshape my world. Gwynevere became my confidant, my counselor, my protector. She would listen patiently as I shared my daily struggles, offering comfort and understanding when I needed it most. She taught me about the forest, which berries were safe to eat, which mushrooms to avoid, how to read weather patterns in the behavior of birds. But as months passed, I noticed subtle changes in my fairy friend. Her expression would darken when I arrived with fresh bruises or tear-stained cheeks. The gentle light that surrounded her would pulse with something that looked almost like anger. "They have no right," she would say, her voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "No right to treat you this way." I remember one autumn evening particularly clearly. I had arrived at our usual meeting spot, a small clearing carpeted with moss. After an especially harsh encounter at home, my father had been in one of his moods, and my mother had watched with silent approval as he expressed his disappointment in my existence. Gwynevere's light flickered erratically as she examined the fresh marks on my arms. "This cannot continue," she said, her voice carrying a weight I'd never heard before. "There are ways to solve this problem, little one." "How?" I asked, hope mixing with something darker in my chest. "There's an old oak tree deeper in the forest," she replied, her wings casting strange shadows in the fading light. "Ancient and massive. You can't miss it. If you could bring them there." She trailed off, leaving the solution unspoken, but somehow promised. I trusted Gwynevere completely. She had been my only source of kindness, my only protector, in a world that seemed designed to harm. When she suggested a solution, I didn't question it. I didn't want to question it. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, during a rare quiet moment at home, I noticed my parents' phones sitting on the kitchen counter. Without really planning it, I grabbed them both and ran toward the back door. "You little thief!" my father shouted, his chair scraping loudly against the floor as he stood. My mother followed, as I knew she would. I ran into the forest, my feet finding the path to the oak tree without conscious thought. My parents ran behind me, their angry shouts echoing through the trees. My father's voice was slurred. He'd started drinking early that day. The oak tree appeared exactly as Gwynevere had described it. Its trunk was wider than our car, its branches reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. I stopped at its base, turning to face my pursuers. My parents emerged from the undergrowth, their faces twisted with familiar anger. My father raised his hand, stepping forward with obvious intent. But then something changed. Their expressions shifted from anger to confusion, then to something I'd never seen before. Pure, absolute terror. They were looking at something behind me, something I couldn't see. Their faces went pale, their bodies rigid. Then, without a sound, they simply collapsed. I stood there for a long time, watching the still forms of my parents in the growing darkness. I should have felt something: fear, grief, guilt. But all I experienced was a profound sense of relief. Eventually, I turned and walked home, leaving them where they lay. The official explanation was heart attacks, somehow occurring simultaneously. The authorities called it a tragic coincidence, though I noticed they seemed eager to close the investigation quickly. No one asked too many questions about the bruises on my arms or the state of our home. Everyone knew, but said nothing, did nothing. I went into the foster system, eventually being placed with a kind family in Dublin. They helped me work through my trauma, supported my education, showed me what a loving family could be. I thrived under their care, eventually becoming a child psychiatrist myself. I never saw Gwynevere again after that night. Sometimes I wonder if she was real, or if my young mind had created her as a coping mechanism. But then I remember the look in her eyes, when she suggested the oak tree. That ancient knowledge mixed with fierce protection, and I know she was as real as the scars I still carry. I visited that forest as an adult, found the old oak tree still standing proud and terrible. The area around it remains strangely empty. No birds nest in its branches. No animals den near its roots. The locals avoid it without really knowing why, telling their children to stay away without being able to explain their unease. Sometimes, when I'm working with children who remind me of my younger self, I think about Gwynevere and her solution. I wonder if she was truly kind, or if she was something older and darker, something that simply found common cause with a suffering child. Perhaps she was both. After all, I've learned that few things in this world are purely good or evil. The forest behind my childhood home is mostly gone now, replaced by housing developments and small shops. But that oak tree still stands, protected by local conservation laws that no one quite remembers passing. The Fog of Eldermourne. Childhood memories have a way of softening over time, their sharp edges worn smooth by years of reflection. But some experiences remain vivid, refusing to fade no matter how many years pass. The afternoon I came face to face with the Fog of Eldermourne is one such memory, preserved with a clarity that still sends shivers down my spine 25 years later. Growing up in our small Irish town, the fog was as much a part of our lives as the ancient cobblestone of our streets or the persistent drizzle that seemed to fall 9 months of the year. But this wasn't your ordinary coastal mist or morning haze. The Eldermourne fog had a presence to it, a weight that seemed to press against your skin and blur the boundaries between what was real and what lurked in childhood imagination. Parents spoke of the fog in hushed tones, their warnings carrying an urgency that went beyond normal parental caution. "When the fog comes, you come home," my mother would say, her eyes holding mine until I nodded my understanding. No excuses, no delays, straight home. Every child in Eldermourne grew up hearing stories about other children who hadn't heeded this warning. They would vanish into the white void, never to return. These tales were always just vague enough to doubt, always about a friend's cousin or a neighbor's nephew. Like most children, I maintained a careful balance between skepticism and fear, not quite believing the stories, but never quite brave enough to test their truth. That changed one autumn afternoon when I was 12. The day had started beautifully clear, one of those rare Irish days when the sun seemed determined to remind us it existed. My friends and I had gathered at the football pitch behind St. Mary's School for an impromptu match, taking advantage of the good weather. I remember every detail of that moment, the scuff marks on my new trainers, the way the grass needed cutting, the sound of Tommy O'Brien arguing about whether the ball had crossed the makeshift goal line we'd marked with our jumpers. Sean Murphy was the first to notice the change in the air. "Look," Sean said, pointing toward the hills that bordered our town. "It's coming." We all turned to watch the fog rolling down the slopes like a living thing, thick and white and somehow purposeful in its advance. It moved faster than fog should, consuming trees and houses in its path with an appetite that seemed almost conscious. "Time to head home," Tommy said, already gathering his things. The others nodded, our game forgotten in the face of ingrained warning. But then Kevin McGrath, with all the bravado of his 13 years, looked at me with that particular smile that always meant trouble. Unless someone wants to prove they're not a baby, he said. 30 minutes in the fog. That's all it would take to show everyone you're not scared. I should have walked away. Should have remembered every warning, every story, every stern parental lecture. But at 12, pride and peer pressure form a potent combination. 30 minutes isn't even that long, I heard myself say. Dean's going to do it, Kevin announced to the others, his voice carrying equal parts excitement and disbelief. We'll time you. Just stay where we can see you from the road. The fog was nearly upon us now, its leading edge turning the sunshine gray. My friends retreated to the safety of the school. Behind the windows, their faces showed a mixture of admiration and concern that fed my determination. As the fog enveloped me, the world contracted to a sphere of white no more than a few feet in diameter. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the moisture in the air clung to my skin like cold sweat. Time became difficult to track in the whiteness. I began counting in my head, trying to gauge how many minutes had passed. The fog seemed to thicken with each passing moment, until I could barely see my own feet against the grass. That's when I heard it, a sound that didn't belong in our small town or in any natural world I knew. It was like wings, but wrong somehow, too heavy and wet. The sound moved around me in circles, always just beyond my limited field of vision. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding flat and lifeless in the fog. Kevin, is that you? The response wasn't human. It was a rasping intake of breath, the sound of air being drawn through something that wasn't quite a throat. I turned toward the noise and saw it. The Slaugh. In all the years since, I've never found words to adequately describe what I saw in the fog that day. It was darkness given form, a thing of wings and angles that shouldn't exist, with eyes that reflected a hunger older than human understanding. Its shape seemed to shift and flow, as if the fog itself was part of its substance. I ran. The rational part of my mind knew the layout of the football pitch perfectly. I had played there hundreds of times, but in the fog, all certainty vanished. Every direction felt wrong. Every step seemed to take me further from safety rather than toward it. I could feel its presence pursuing me, an ancient and malevolent awareness that saw me not as a person, but as prey. The cold intensified wherever it drew near, as if it was pulling the heat from the air itself. My lungs burned from running and screaming, though I don't remember making any sound. Just when I felt sure I couldn't run another step, when I could almost feel those impossible wings brushing against my back, something changed. The fog began to thin ever so slightly. Shapes became more distinct, and I caught a glimpse of the stone wall that marked the pitch's boundary. The Slaugh made one final lunge. I felt its cold presence wash over me like a wave of winter air. I could have sworn I saw teeth, so many teeth, everywhere. But the fog was lifting faster now, and with it went the creature's power. I burst out of the white barrier and found myself standing at the same spot as I did before. That wasn't even 15 minutes. Kevin opened the window, sounding disappointed. You barely lasted half the time. They hadn't seen anything unusual, hadn't heard my screams, or seen my desperate flight. To them, I had simply emerged from the fog, breathing hard and looking scared. I didn't try to explain what had happened. Even then, I knew they wouldn't believe me. Why would they? The fog lifted completely within minutes, returning our town to its normal state of gentle autumn sunshine. But something had changed within me, some fundamental understanding of the world and its boundaries. Looking back now, with children of my own, I understand why our parents' warnings carried such weight. The fog that descends on Eldermourne isn't just a weather phenomenon. It's a veil between our world and something else, something that watches and waits with infinite patience. I've made my home in Dublin now, where the fog is just fog and the most dangerous things are mundane and human. Yet, on certain nights, when the fog rolls in and transforms familiar streets into mysterious landscapes, I find myself listening for wing beats. And in those moments, I wonder about all those children from the stories, the ones who vanished into the fog and never returned. I wonder if they're truly gone, or if they exist somehow in that other place, that white void where ancient things still hunt with patient hunger. The Turnip Lanterns. Alice and I had been dating for 8 months when we visited the National Museum of Ireland that fateful Saturday. Our relationship had been developing naturally, organically, like something that had always meant to exist. She was pursuing her PhD in Celtic literature while I worked as a software developer, and we shared a deep curiosity about history and culture that made museum visits one of our favorite weekend activities. That particular day had started perfectly. The autumn air was crisp but not cold, and Dublin streets were alive with that particular energy that comes with early weekend mornings. Alice wore her favorite green sweater, the one that matched her eyes, and her excitement about the museum's new Celtic artifacts exhibit was contagious. "Just wait until you see the manuscript fragments they've recovered," she said as we climbed the museum steps, her voice carrying that passionate tone she reserved for historical discoveries. "The preservation techniques they've used are revolutionary." We spent the morning moving through the exhibits at our usual pace, stopping frequently to read every plaque and discuss the implications of each artifact. Alice had a way of bringing history to life, connecting ancient objects to the human stories behind them. I loved watching her mind work, seeing connections form between her academic knowledge and the physical evidence before us. Then we entered the room containing the ghost turnip. The artifact sat in a simple glass case, illuminated by soft lighting that seemed somehow wrong for it. The placard described it as a preserved turnip lantern from the 17th century, found in a bog near Galway. But those clinical words couldn't capture the wrongness of the object, the way it seemed to exist slightly out of sync with the reality around it. "It's beautifully preserved," Alice remarked, leaning closer to examine the intricate carving. "Look at how the features have held their shape despite the centuries." But I couldn't move closer. Something about the turnip held me rooted in place, my feet suddenly heavy as lead. The carved face seemed to shift slightly when viewed from different angles, its expression transforming from a simple, decorative pattern into something malevolent and aware. "Are you okay?" Alice asked, noticing my discomfort. "You've gone quite pale." "Just feeling a bit claustrophobic," I lied, unable to explain the dread that had settled into my bones. "Maybe we should get some air?" We left the museum shortly after, but the ghost turnip had already taken root in my mind. That night, I dreamed of it, not as the preserved artifact behind glass, but as something alive and hungry, its carved features moving with terrible purpose. The changes began subtly. I found myself gravitating toward the produce section during grocery shopping, specifically the root vegetables. The shape and weight of turnips in my hands felt significant somehow, as if they contained secrets waiting to be revealed. I started carving them, telling myself it was just a seasonal hobby, a way to connect with ancient traditions. Alice found it charming at first, even helping me research traditional Celtic carving patterns. But as the weeks passed, my interest evolved into an obsession. My apartment gradually filled with turnip lanterns, each one carved with increasingly intricate patterns that I didn't remember creating. I would lose hours in the process, coming back to awareness with my hands stained and sticky, surrounded by new creations that seemed to watch me with collective intent. Work began to suffer. I called in sick more frequently, using the time to perfect my carving technique. The patterns that emerged felt less like artistic choices and more like compulsions, my hands guided by something beyond my conscious control. My dreams became filled with root vegetables and ancient symbols, whispered meanings that dissolved upon waking. "Jake, we need to talk about this," Alice said one evening, her voice carrying a concern that part of me recognized as justified. She stood in my living room, surrounded by dozens of turnip lanterns, their carved faces casting strange shadows in the dim light. "This isn't healthy anymore." I tried to explain the importance of what I was doing, but the words came out wrong, tangled with meanings I hadn't intended. Looking back, I can only imagine how I appeared to her, unwashed, surrounded by slowly rotting vegetables, talking about patterns and possibilities that made sense only in my increasingly distorted reality. "I think you need help," she said finally, her voice breaking slightly. "Professional help, and I can't watch this happen anymore." We broke up. I remember her tears, her frustrated attempts to reach the person I used to be, but mostly, I remember the turnips watching us, their carved faces seeming to smile at her distress. What happened next fills me with shame, though my memories of it are fragmented and strange. I remember entering her apartment late one night. I must have still had the spare key she'd given me months earlier. I brought my creations with me, dozens of them. Each turnip lantern was positioned precisely, creating a pattern that felt significant, though I couldn't have explained why. Their carved faces glowed with an inner light I hadn't provided, casting shadows that moved independently of any natural law. When Alice came home and found her apartment transformed into a gallery of my obsession, her scream jolted something loose in my mind. For a moment, I saw my creations through her eyes, not as the meaningful artifacts I had imagined, but as manifestations of a profound disturbance. I heard her calling the police as I fled into the night. That was the last real thing I remember before everything changed. The official investigation turned up nothing. My apartment was found empty except for dozens of rotting turnip lanterns. Their carved faces collapsed into unrecognizable organic decay. My bank accounts remained untouched. My passport unused. According to all official records, I simply vanished. But that's not quite true. I didn't vanish. I transformed. The ghost turnip in the museum had recognized something in me that day, something that had always been there, waiting to be awakened. My obsession wasn't madness. It was metamorphosis. I exist now in spaces between spaces, in the shadows cast by carved vegetables and the whispered stories of ancient traditions. Sometimes, when the veil between worlds grows thin, I catch glimpses of my former life. I see Alice completing her PhD, moving forward with her life, occasionally touching the protective charm she now wears around her neck. I see the ghost turnip in its museum case, waiting patiently for the next person who will understand its invitation, its vision. The carved face still shifts when viewed from different angles, but now I understand that it's not an illusion, it's a doorway.